Perfect. Okay, so we are recording, and I want to welcome Gary Lockman, back to Neural Learning. Now, a little bit earlier this year, we did a fun little Q&A that was a live stream, but I'm just so glad to actually be back to be learning about the lost knowledge of the imagination. And this book is a bit of a treasure trove of this form of studies, and I'm just really excited that we kind of get to do a deep dive with you, Gary. So I just want to welcome you and welcome everybody who's here for the class, and I'm just excited to get started.
Well, thank you for having me on, Jeremy. It's always a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to it. And yeah, what I'm going to do is I'm just sort of going to go through the book, as it were. You may have read some of it already or not, but that's sort of the general kind of narrative I'll be following here. And the book starts out, and the reason for the book is, well, the idea that there is a knowledge that's associated with the imagination, but we somehow it's been lost. And the whole phrase "lost knowledge of the imagination" comes from the poet and Blake scholar Kathleen Raine, and I'll get around to talking a bit more about her further on. But she's the one who had this phrase in several of her essays, and it was while writing another book that it kept coming up. And in a way, this book, Lost Knowledge of the Imagination, is kind of a distilled essence of a larger book, one of the books that I put on the list of reading if you wanted to get it, Secret Teachers of the Western World, which is a more sort of synoptic overview of the esoteric tradition through the Western history. And Lost Knowledge kind of takes the essence of what I would say is kind of the sort of the fundamental themes and ideas that are kind of moved through or followed through in this larger kind of narrative. But the reason this knowledge of the imagination, in the first place, we think of, we don't usually associate knowledge with the imagination. So that is a kind of odd pairing to begin with. But how it got lost or rejected or misplaced or forgotten is that in the 17th century, and maybe you might want to go to the first of the slides, get those up. There was a sudden change in how we understand knowledge. That's sort of the opening here. I was calling it a different kind of knowing. And it's sort of ironic that I have this photo of this statue by Palozzi, who's a Italian artist who did this for. This is in the front of the British Library in London, which I go to often, and it's kind of like, the world's knowledge is here. But it's interesting because it's based on a Blake painting of Newton. And I'm sure the British Library thinks this is a celebration of Newtonian kind of ideas and logic and reason and scientific view. But if you know Blake, you know Blake's painting, and practically anything Blake had to say about Newton was just, against him, was very, very critical. So it always struck me as sort of ironic that they have this huge statue of Newton, which is based on a Blake painting, and the Blake painting is an argument against the very thing that they seem to be celebrating there. The thing that Blake is arguing against, and that Newton is very associated with, is precisely what I said in the next slide. Is it easier for me to do it on my end, Jeremy, than it is for you? Because if I could just press the the button, I'll do that rather than ask you. But whatever.
I think we're good for this session. Yeah.
Okay. Fine. Okay. All right. So I have up here something changed in the 17th century. And what that was this new way of knowing and understanding the world and ourselves and our experience came. It became very prevalent. It didn't come out of nowhere, but it had such a sudden effect in historical terms that it seemed sort of like a knowledge explosion or a revolution, you can say. It's been in sort of a dominant position now for the last 400 years, which 400 years seems like a long time for us individually, but historically it's a relatively short time. And if you consider the millennia that preceded what happened in the 17th century, the degree of change that's taken place in human life, and not only human life on the planet, is enormous compared to, all the thousands and thousands of years that preceded. But although this sudden change to this new way of knowing, which we've subsequently come to understand as, scientific or rationalist or materialist, or a variety of different sort of ways, what I'll be focusing on as we go along is the sort of quantitative aspect of it, because that was the thing that characterized it more than anything else, that what was knowable, or what we could consider knowledge, was something that we could quantify in some way, and we could show it to be quantified. We could measure it, and this was something that was new. Not to say that people didn't measure before. They obviously did measure things. I mean, geometry goes back to the ancients, but the idea that for anything to qualify as being real, it would have to be amenable to this kind of treatment, and that excluded quite a few things, which we'll get along to. But as I say, even though this started in the 17th century, and I have some of the usual suspects here, it goes back a bit earlier. We have Copernicus, we have Descartes, and who's very much smack dab in the middle of it, and then Newton later on. There's a few other usual suspects who I haven't put up in here, like Galileo, let's say, or Kepler. But the interesting thing about these three gentlemen here was that although we associate them with this new scientific, quantitative way of knowing things and understanding the world, each of them were steeped in the previous kind of knowledge tradition, or were steeped in one strain of it, which I guess we could call it the Hermetic tradition, the esoteric tradition. Copernicus, if you know your Francis Yates, Copernicus got a lot from the Hermetic texts about the centrality of the sun. And Descartes, again, if you know Descartes, he tried to track down the Rosicrucians when the Rosicrucians furore was happening. He even had to prove to friends of, well, there's a joke about him that because no one could find the Rosicrucians, they were called the Invisibles. And when Descartes had heard that people were saying that Descartes had become a Rosicrucian, he's gone over to the mystics. He sort of came up to them at a cafe or a pub or something and said, "Can you see me?" And I said, "Yes, we can." "Well, there's proof I am not a Rosicrucian. I'm not invisible," or something along those kinds of lines. And Newton, again, Newton is the Cartesian Newtonian universe of the clockwork and so on and so on. But Newton wrote more about alchemy than he did about gravity. And gravity itself is an occult force because no one's ever seen it. And at the time when he was promoting his ideas or discussing them, a lot of people criticized him precisely for that. There's some notion of action at a distance or something like that. So it's just ironic that three figures that are associated with this new revolutionary way of knowing that supposedly wiped out this earlier tradition are actually very much a part of it. But we can trace this back to an earlier time, and maybe the next slide is in order. And this goes back to a period that the German existentialist philosopher Karl Jaspers, who's over here in black and white, looking very professorial, he called the Axial Age. And this was a period, as you can see on this kind of map I just found on the internet earlier today. It stretches quite a bit, 800 to 400 BC. I guess you could say, like, the 5 or 6 is kind of smack in the middle. And this is a period, Jasper said that this fundamental shift had taken place in civilization, in human history. And it was a time when these great religious and moral and ethical leaders all seemed to appear relatively, simultaneously. So you had, Taoism and Confucius in China. You had the Buddha in India. One of the dates for Zoroaster is around this time. I know Zoroastrian studies. There are different dates for Zoroaster, but he's also associated with this time as well. And in the sort of Holy Lands, you have the ancient Hebrew patriarchs and so on. And each of these figures created a moral and ethical teaching of philosophy that Jaspers argued laid the fundaments for what we understand as sort of civilization. And something along the same lines happened in Greece, but in a different way, where in each of the other places, as I say, it was sort of an ethical, a moral, a spiritual, a religious sort of flowering of an answer to the question of the meaning of life and the purpose of life and what's the aim and how to live a good life. That's not quite what happened in Greece. In Greece was the beginning of what we can call rationality and reason. And if you want to go to the next slide, this was a shift that's sort of generally considered from a kind of mythic way of understanding the world to a mental one. And you can find this in a variety of different writers. Jean Gebser is someone who talks about this quite a bit. This is something that Jaspers points out, is that whereas in the other parts of the world you have the flowering of a very important moral, ethical, spiritual philosophy, what you start to have in Greece and around Asia Minor is this beginning of what we would later call science. Because what these pre-Socratic philosophers, these philosophers who came before Socrates, were interested in was not the good life, nor did they want a mythic narrative to explain how the universe came into being. That was something that Hesiod, who's on one side over here, underneath mythic, that's what he provided. He provided the poems and the narratives and the stories about how the gods created the universe and the world and things of that sort. And other poets and other bards and other cultures did something similar. But what people like this gentleman underneath Mental, Thales, who's technically called the first philosopher, but it's a little anachronistic because the word hadn't been invented yet. But he wasn't interested in what was the good life. He wasn't interested in a narrative explaining how the universe came into being. He wanted to know what was stuff made of. He picked up a rock and he said, what is this made of? Fundamentally, what is this thing here that I have in my hand here? Or he'll look at a cloud or something along that. So anachronistically, he wanted to know what made things tick. I mean, it's anachronistic because there weren't any clocks quite yet at that time. But he wanted to get sort of inside things, but not inside them, let's say, as a way we will talk about later on in this course, which is more like on the mythic side, where you get inside something, you participate with it. What had happened with Thales and the Greeks there is they seem to embody a very, very sharp differentiation from the world around them. And they could see it, they could objectify it very vividly and clearly. And they could see it as an object. And this is what Thales and other ones around him at this time who followed him, Anaxagoras and Anaximander and other philosophers of this time, is they wanted to know what was the fundamental stuff. That's the best, what is the cloud made of, and what is the rock made of, and what is the water made of? And each of them came up with an answer. I mean, Thales, said it was all water. Heraclitus later said it was fire, and other ones said different sorts of things. And from our perspective, they seem, rather kind of outlandish, kind of nonsensical answers. But you have to understand that they actually had a very rigorous argument for each of these things. And in a way, that's more important than whether their answers were right or not, was that they were trying to understand something. They were trying to use reason and the beginning of logic to sort of know what this primal kind of material is. And this is something that the English scholar George Steiner said was the beginning of an interest in something for its own enigmatic sake. It wasn't useful in the way you didn't want to sort of get practical knowledge about it. You didn't want to know what this, what could I get from this plant in the forest, or, that sort of thing. And you didn't want to know, again, how it could be used in any kind of religious sort of thing. You just were curious about it. You just kind of wanted to take it apart. And this was something that was very, very new. Nowhere else had this arisen, at least as far as we know. And this is generally associated with the West and with the Greeks in this area. And the German philosopher Edmund Husserl, who was a little bit earlier than Jaspers, he said this was the beginning of what he called theoretical man. And so it was from that change, you could later on, what we started out talking about, the science in the 17th century sort of has its roots in that. But this kind of tradition of sort of the, what do you want to call it, analytical understanding of trying to understand the fundamental, primary matter of something going on. That carried on for a while, and I guess the scientific sort of tradition, let's say, in Greek philosophy carried on, roughly with Aristotle, and then it kind of peters out, and it peters out around the same time as pagan philosophy in general is sort of leaving the stage with the rise of Christianity. And when you get the rise of Christianity, they're not really interested in this kind of thing, and neither were the Judaic, the Jews. They weren't interested in this sort of thing either. And it takes a while before it starts to come back, and we can get to the next slide. So you have this thrust in human curiosity, wanting to sort of understand what makes things tick in a purely objective, detached kind of way, and it peters out, and it sort of gets fed back into the West through the Arabs after Aristotle gets picked up by the Arabs and so on and so on. It kind of gets fed back, but the beginning of a similar kind of interest in nature, not necessarily just for itself, because you can't really do that now because everything is about God, but it's trying to understand how God is manifesting in nature. And the Christians didn't really think about nature that much until around, let's say, the 9th century. And there was a figure named John Duns Scotus, or John Erigena, who basically, he was from Ireland. And he was asked to translate a text that had come into the possession. I forget who it is right now. One of the kings or something or other. No one could. It was all in Greek, and no one could understand it. And this was during the Dark Ages, or if you think they weren't that dark, they were certainly dim. It was sort of during the dim ages, and people didn't understand the Greek, so they couldn't translate this. And what this is a text called the Divine Code of Harmonies, and it was by an anonymous monk from Syria, who we've come to know as Dionysius the Areopagite. And why he was important is he was one of the last students of a teacher from the Platonic Academy before it was closed down by Justinian in, I think, 529. And what Dionysius the Areopagite, or the pseudo-Dionysius, because that's not really his name, but what he did is he sort of brought together the nascent Christianity with this complex Neoplatonic emanationist system of metaphysics from an absolute one, and then stages of different differentiation as you come further down to us, to the material world. You can see this in Kabbalah, and you see it in Hermeticism, and it's a kind of standard motif. And by the late stages, or the last days of pagan philosophy, the Neoplatonic system, which starts with Plotinus, it become very, very complex with Proclus. And Dionysius took that, and then he combined it with the beginning of the whole Christian spiritual universe of the cherubim and the seraphim and the angels and the archangels and the principalities and powers. And this book he wrote was basically a blending of those two things. And when John of Ireland sort of translated that, he also, after doing that, wrote a book calling The Divisions of Nature. And the whole idea was that, there were a kind of hierarchy of patterns and forms in nature that embody or communicate or manifest, God's design in different kinds of things. And so we begin on the road towards what, we call sacred geometry. And you begin to see this in the Gothic cathedrals. And one of the reasons why you have the stained glass windows in the Gothic cathedrals, and that's from Chartres, the rose window there. The black and white picture is Notre Dame. The reason we have the stained glass windows is precisely because of this kind of Neoplatonic philosophy, because what Dionysius said, that the closest thing to a manifestation of the divine on earth is light. And Abbot Suger, who had the commission to redesign a cathedral, took that on board, and he asked for more and more windows and more light. And so the whole idea was that the light was a way in which to sort of transmit this presence of God, through the material world. But that led on to more and more paying attention to nature itself. And the next slide will take us one more stage. Then we have the Renaissance, where it inherits, of course, the humanist tradition of Plato and all the Greek sages and scholars who hadn't been translated, whose work had been lost. But it also inherits the Hermetic tradition. The discovery of the Corpus Hermeticum is one of the most important moments for the Renaissance. And when Marsilio Ficino translates it from Greek into Latin, and he kickstarts the new Platonic Academy with some help from Cosimo de' Medici. This, in many ways, informs what we know as the Renaissance. Artists like Michelangelo and Botticelli and so on and others are heavily influenced by the sort of Hermetic humanism that Ficino is translating, but also Pico della Mirandola as well. And he wrote his famous oration on the dignity of man. And he basically is announcing that, henceforth human beings don't need to feel wretched. They don't need to feel like they're just sinners, that they're lowly creatures here who needs God's grace in order to be saved. And that was, the picture of human life that the church more or less maintained. And so suddenly man is this kind of titan, is this kind of, powerful being, a god on earth. And it's not science yet, but they are trying to crack the secrets of the universe. And again, this is the kind of proto-science, you might say, or the Hermetic science that, as I said, people like Copernicus and others, I didn't have Kepler in it, but he would have been there, Kepler and Newton, use when they're developing their own kind of vision of the world. So you get to the very next thing, and this is when the big change comes in, though. Okay, so as I said, what happens is that, so you have this tremendous confidence in human ability to understand the universe, but it's no longer about understanding God in the same way, let's say, or if they're trying to understand God, they're trying to understand God in the way that Stephen Hawking said it was, and basically saying, well, you need the mind of a God in order to understand the universe. And by the way, I happen to have one. So it's that kind of, it's not like there's God, in the ancient sense that you try to understand his or her or whatever's intentions. It's that, yes, we can understand the universe, but we understand it by subtracting everything that smacks of any kind of subjectivity from it, anything that we consider, meaning in the general human experience. So, where Dante had said, love that moves the planets and the stars and the sun, in order to understand the laws of planetary motion, you have to give up all idea that anything is moving the planets. The angels aren't pushing the planets around. You have to just, observe, and measure and quantify. And lo and behold, you will discover that there are what came to be known as laws of nature, regularities that are absolute and fundamental and never changing. And we can understand them precisely by, I'm sorry, I keep moving my computer around. We can understand them precisely by subtracting from them what we thought we knew. And that's fundamentally the kind of mythic view that was still lingering in there. We know, it's today, everyone more or less accepts that, the angels aren't doing anything up there. But back then, you still would have to have been a rare person in order to really embrace that idea. And they were very bold, intrepid souls who were, pushing aside the commonly held view of things. And this had been true for hundreds of years. So there was some kind of mythic view. It was the Christian mythos view, whatever. It was something like that. There was a narrative going on, and that was why things were. But with the rise of this new way of thinking and way of knowing, in order for it to be successful, and it was very successful, but in order for it to be successful, it had to subtract all of that. It had to, completely jettison any idea of the kind of notion that there's any kind of narrative, any kind of meaning, any kind of purpose of teleological character to things at all. You just have to sit and watch and count, and then you'll see. And this has become incredibly successful. It's put probes out beyond how anyone could have ever dreamed of human effort going. And we are, right now, we're enjoying, the fruits of its success, being able to talk over the internet and have this kind of conversation. So, we don't need to spend a lot of time on pointing out the benefits that have come to us from this change in things. But, it comes at a price. And saying that is actually an interesting way to go to the next slide. It comes at a price because what you get ultimately is what the traditionalist philosopher Rene Guénon called the reign of quantity. And this was when quality is completely excised from our perception of the world. Quality is just subjective. It's something that just takes place within each of our individual heads or minds. So, one man's meat is another man's poison. Something I find beautiful, you may find it just, boring, and so on and so on. The one thing that we can all agree on is quantity. 2 + 2 = 4, no matter how you feel, no matter how I feel. And again, it's remarkably successful, but it brings everything down to a rather narrow view of things. And you can say, one of the consequences of living in the reign of quantity is that we have these kinds of phenomena, which I think is going on over this weekend, if I'm not mistaken, this Black Friday sort of thing, where people line up outside of shops or shopping malls, whatever, the night before in order to get fantastic sales on items which, if it wasn't on sale, they probably wouldn't bother to go there. So this is one of the consequences of this world that we live in now, because of the success of this new way of knowing. It's one of the prices we pay. We pay for it. But do things have to be like this? This is okay. Oh, sorry. One more thing here. And even beyond this, no, the next one. Sorry. My mistake. I was looking at my notes. The even beyond just the kind of consumerism, or propelling the consumerism in some fundamental metaphysical way, some bottom existential sort of way, is this idea that what ultimately we arrive at through this very successful way of understanding things is that the universe is absolutely meaningless. It's purposeless. There's no meaning behind it whatsoever. The gentleman over there peering at us, rather sort of a scowl there, is Steve Weinberg, and he's the physicist. And in the book of his called The First 3 Minutes, which is an account of the first 3 minutes after the Big Bang. Can I tell my Big Bang joke? My Big Bang joke is that I don't believe there's a Big Bang. And there's 2 reasons. And it's precisely because of the name. And one is size is relative, is it not? All right. So if there was nothing, not even nothing, less than nothing, how could it be big? You can't compare it to anything else. So it's not big, it's not small, it's not anything. And there could be no bang because, well, there's no atmosphere in space. There was no space for which there to be an atmosphere. And neither were there any ears anywhere to pick up the vibrations in the atmosphere for it to make a noise. So I call it the indefinably dimensional dud, is the way I understand the Big Bang. So just the term itself undermines itself ruthlessly, I think. In any case, so Steven Weinberg wrote a book called The First 3 Minutes about the Big Bang. And at the end of the book, he says, I'm sort of paraphrasing it, but the more we understand the universe, the more it seems pointless. One wonders if he had stayed around longer than just the first 3 minutes, he may have come up with a different assessment at the end of things. But this whole idea that the more we understand the universe through this quantifiable method, the more it just seems more and more purposeless. I mean, I don't know how many degrees of purposelessness there is. I think if you're either purposeless or you're not, but it just becomes even more purposeless. So okay, so here we are, reign of quantity, and we're out there lost in the cosmos now. At least before, when we didn't have this very successful way of knowing, at least we felt at home in the cosmos somewhere. We were within, this nice cradle of different celestial spheres, according to the old Ptolemaic view of things. But now we're in this open-ended space that just goes on indefinitely in all directions, and so on and so on. So we find ourselves, as Walker Percy, the novelist, called it in a book of his, lost in the cosmos. But does it have to be like this? I guess that's the question. That's the one I was going to get to. And that's the next slide. Well, according to this gentleman here, the eminent historian, Jacques Barzun, who died a few years back, I think at the age of 104, if I'm not mistaken. So he pretty much saw all of the 20th century. What he said is this attitude, this whole idea that precisely because of the success of this particular way of knowing, that it has become the arbiter of what's real and what's not, and what's knowledge and what isn't knowledge. This has become a religion. And he didn't coin the phrase scientism. I'm not exactly sure who was the first person to use that phrase, but he does say this is what it has resulted in. This kind of, and you have to say there's a kind of urge in this approach to reach the most economical sort of answer to something. You know, something that is like the how do you want to say it? The smallest thing to be able to account for the largest sort of area of inquiry. That's almost like a kind of aesthetic given in this kind of thing. That's why people, you know, the whole idea of a theory of everything that'll fit on a T-shirt or something like that, which sounds like, you know, yes, you know, you should be able to reduce everything to something of such a basic simplicity that everything else can unfold from it. And this whole idea, based on just the sheer efficiency of this way of thinking, because it can be applied and it had practical results, and that's why, you know, that's why it's been so successful. But this results in what Barzun refers to and others have as scientism. And scientism is the belief, and it is a belief, that it's not even a theory, it's a belief that all questions of human nature, all questions of reality, and so on and so on, can ultimately be answered through this method. And if they can't be answered through this method, then they're really not real questions, which is, you know, at different times in the history of ideas and history of philosophy and science, has been different people that have tried to come up with some way to knock all the other metaphysical or, you know, the kind of existential questions knock them out of the ring just by saying, well, you know, if you can't do this, then it's just nonsense what you're saying. But, you know, Barzun, who's a very intelligent human being, who's a historian, he wrote a wonderful book about William James, and the book that I refer to in my book, or I'm taking a quote from him, is this enormous tome called From Dawn to Decadence, which if you ever get a chance, it's just a remarkable book to read, and it's basically from the Renaissance into contemporary times. I said he lived into, I think, 104, and I think he wrote it in 2000. It was sort of published in 2000. So it goes from the Renaissance to rap music and gangster rap and stuff like that. And it's basically the kind of undoing of Western culture. And one of the agents for that is this whole idea that the only way we can arrive at any kind of truth, the only way that of guaranteed real knowing is through this method. And he says, no, that's not true. And one of the people he points to is, next slide, Jeremy, is, if you will, is this fellow here on the end, Blaise Pascal. What we have here is Blaise Pascal and Ernst Junger, the German writer Ernst Junger. You wouldn't think they had much in common, but they actually do. And Pascal was someone who was a friend of Descartes. He was a younger contemporary, but he sat in on kind of philosophical and mathematical sessions with Descartes and Descartes' friends. Pascal was a child prodigy, and he was absolutely brilliant. But he was a logician. He developed one of the first sort of computers or calculating machines. It was something called the Pascaline that he invented for his father. His father was a tax collector, so he needed something to be able to calculate, you know, the taxes quickly and so on and so on. And but he was also what we would call an existential kind of thinker. He was a deeply religious soul, and he too. He looked out in the vast cosmos, and he too felt lost in the cosmos. And when Steven Weinberg's looking out at it and telling us it's absolutely pointless, I mean, Pascal was looking at it in the same way a few centuries earlier. And he famously said, you know, the eternal silence of these infinite spaces terrifies me. So he's very, very early one to sort of have this sense of, yes, we are lost in the cosmos. What is this space we are in that's just endlessly going, you know? But he also, he wasn't really a mystic, but he had at least one mystical experience. And after his death, inside his coat or his vest, he had sewn a piece of paper in which he had written down an account of this experience he had. And it just was one page and just was a few words, but he just sort of says, fire, fire, and then tears of joy. And fundamentally, he had an experience of the true living, breathing God. And he says, not the God of the philosophers or the logicians, but the God of Abraham and Isaac. So this real, absolute, powerful, almost visceral experience of the presence of God. But one of the things he also left after his death was a collection of notes known as his pensée, or his thoughts. And in them, he talks about what he calls the spirit of geometry and the spirit of finesse. And the spirit of geometry is this way of knowing that was, taking off at the time, analyzing, calculating, quantifying, and all of that. And the spirit of finesse is something else. I mean, finesse, I don't know, it's, if you play pool, people say you have to finesse that shot, or if you're, you put a little finesse on the basketball when you're shooting it, or, when you're playing an instrument or something, it's something that gives a particular character and personality to the way you play rather than, someone else or something like that. But it's something that it's incalculable. It's a knowing. It's a knowing how to do something, but it isn't something that can be calculated. Whereas the spirit of geometry, you can show someone step by step how to do something. You can take them from theory to whatever to the next step, and 1, 2, 3, and there you go. There's no argument. Or if you follow those steps, you will arrive at the same triangle I did, and no questions asked. But you can't really show this other way of knowing in the same way. The sort of spirit of finesse, you can't. And something else related to that Pascal said, and he's very famous for, is he says, the heart has reasons that the mind doesn't know. And I'm paraphrasing him again. There's a kind of a reasoning, a thinking of the heart that's different than the thinking of the mind, and it carries ways of understanding that isn't immediately communicable to the other organ up there. And so with Pascal, you have somebody he's a logician, he's a mathematician on one side, but he also has this deep religious feeling, and he has this deep awareness of the kind of existential angst that more and more people are going to feel. It's, a couple centuries on, it's going to be something that afflicts a whole generation. And we today, we postmoderns who, I don't know, whatever, I guess is our sort of attitude towards things, we still kind of exist in this kind of atmosphere of that kind of meaninglessness that Pascal was one of the early warning signals about. But the reason I have Ernst Junger next to him, and you might not know who Ernst Junger is, he's not that well known in English-speaking world, but he's a brilliant German writer. He was a decorated World War I hero, and one of his early books was called Storm of Steel, and it's about his account of World War I. But he later became a sort of poetic thinker. He wrote these sort of novels that are not straight narratives, they're more like poetic kind of fables, and there's one called On the Marble Cliffs that's thinly disguised allegory against the Nazis. And he lived in Germany. He was sort of courted by the Nazis, but he kept away from them. But he didn't want anything to do with them. But he was actually kind of a loyal German. He was sort of part of the internal emigre kind of world, as it were. But in the 1930s, he wrote a book called The Adventurous Heart. And this was a book that made a big impact on Albert Hoffman, the fellow who discovered LSD. And because of that book, he got in touch with Junger after he had developed the LSD, and he invited him to come and experiment with it, and they tripped together. And Hoffman writes about this in his book LSD, my troubled child, or something, I forget. But in this book, The Adventurous Heart, which is a collection of sort of short poetic essays and accounts of dreams and sort of insights and hunches and intuitions, Junger has one section where he calls the master key. And he talks about there being, again, two different ways of knowing something. And he says there are people who approach something from the circumference. and I have a bullseye there. So there's people that start out at the outer circle, and they slowly kind of make their way towards the middle. And this is the sort of plodding, step-by-step, normal, everyday way we usually find out about something. And he calls this ant-like industriousness. And, so we each, little by little, we understand something. But he says there are some other people who just go straight to the middle, straight to the midpoint. They know it immediately. They have this kind of direct knowing. And again, a similar analogy he makes is when the difference between someone who has a key, a master key to all the rooms in a house, a big house, a big mansion, or people that have just a key to one room. So if you have the master key, you don't need all the other keys. You have the one key and it opens every door. Same kind of metaphor for this whole idea that, if you can go directly to the midpoint and understand something directly, you don't have to work through it in this kind of industrious way. And one of the problems with this, though, is that the people who understand at the midpoint, much like the people who have a good sense of what Pascal calls finesse, as I said, they can't tell someone else how to do it. You can't show someone, oh yeah, I got there like that. You just do this, you just do this. That's one of the most frustrating things when, someone who has a hunch and it's right. And you say, how'd you know that? I said, well, I don't know. I just knew it. I just saw it. And Junger says it's knowledge that comes at a glance. It's a synoptic view that sees everything all at once rather than each little bit piece by piece, which is what the industrious ant sort of does. So one of the reasons I have these two together here is, as I said, Pascal was a logician, a mathematician. He invented, a calculating kind of machine, but he was also a deeply religious thinker and a wonderful writer. If you ever read the Pensees, they're beautifully written. Junger, as well as being a novelist and an essayist, he was also a scientist. He studied insects, entomologists. There's several different species of beetles and other kinds of insects named after him. So he pursued what we'll talk about in another part of the course, a kind of Goethean science, which is a kind of poetic science. But nevertheless, it was a science. I mean, he's recognized as having, discovered these particular species of insects. So these are examples of what Barzin says when it doesn't have to be one or the other. You can have both of these kind of approaches together. When you have both of them together, you get more of a picture of things. You have the same kind of detailed attention to things that science demands, but it's being buoyed up and informed by a kind of intuition that gives it a depth. So let's go to the next slide. Let me get a sip of water here. See, another example of this is what the philosopher Michael Polanyi called tacit knowing. And again, this is a kind of knowing, it's a knowing how, not a knowing that. He says we know more than we can tell. One of the examples he gives is riding a bicycle. You know how to ride a bicycle, but if you were going to tell someone how to ride it, not show them how to ride it, but tell them, put your hand there, put your foot there, move a little like that, they wouldn't get very far. It's something that we pick up tacitly. We start out as it being kind of an explicit knowing in the sense that we really have to try and do it consciously. And that's true of so many things, riding a bicycle, typing, learning a foreign language, driving a car. The other philosopher I have on the other side there is Alfred North Whitehead. And again, I'm going to paraphrase him, but he said, civilization advances by the number of operations it can perform without thinking about it. And those of us who are spiritually minded might think, hold on, you're saying we should be unconscious, and shouldn't we be conscious? But what he means by that is precisely what I'm just saying about riding the bicycle. When you try to ride the bicycle, or when you learn how to type, and when you learn how to drive, or especially in the middle there, if you learn how to play a musical instrument, initially it's excruciatingly difficult. It's an enormous effort, and you have to apply your conscious mind to it continuously, and you have to, keep going back and back, and you make mistakes and you keep going back and back. And I know when I first learned how to type, you have to constantly be aware of where the letter is and all of that, and the enormous trouble I went through tying my shoes when I was a kid. My God, a complete breakdown at times. So but at some point it just suddenly slips over to some other part of you, and you are not doing it anymore. You are not occupied with where do I where's that letter? Or what do I do now when I'm driving the car? Some other part of you has absorbed all that and it's doing it. And that frees you up for other things. That's what Whitehead means by civilization advancing, by increasing the number of things that we can do without thinking about it consciously. Because what's the most important thing about a car is that where it can take you. Well, if you constantly, have to constantly figure out how do I drive this thing, you're not going to get very far where you want to go. So you give it over to some other part of you, and then you, conscious you, can think about where you want to go. And similarly with other things. And the fellow in the middle is Jascha Heifetz, one of the great violinists of all time. And it seems counterintuitive to say that he's unconscious when he's playing best, but it's unconscious in the sense that he's not, as Polanyi says, he's attending from the music. He's not attending to the music. He got to be Jascha Heifetz because he had to go through years of attending to, had to be constantly aware where his fingers were and all that. Then finally, at some point, he so absorbed this that now he can attend from. And I would say the whole process of learning is that absorption. That's what learning is. A writer who's very influential in my own work, Colin Wilson, he talks about what he calls the robot. And the robot is this kind of labor-saving device that we all have. And it's a part of us that kind of does this sort of thing. It takes it over. We can pass it over to it to do, and then we can focus on something else. And the more things we learn, the more complex does this part of ourselves become. It becomes full of a variety of different kind of learned activities that I can sort of say consciously I want to do, and then it takes over and all that. So here, this is another example of a different kind of knowing than the usual kind of knowing that we're used to. So let's move on to the next one. And where are we on the time?
We got about, let's see, 10, 11 more minutes.
Oh, okay. Oh, really? Oh, God! I thought I was going.
And then we can move into Q&A. No. We're
okay.
good.
Okay. All right. So, okay. Okay. I'll have to go through this quickly then. Okay. So, just another example. So far, we're talking about philosophers and all that kind of thing. So, but this is something that is rooted in actual, neuroscience and brain physiology. You're probably familiar with E. McGilchrist's book, The Master and His Emissary. He rebooted the whole left and right brain discussion, which had kind of petered out in the early 90s because a lot of new age and pop psychologist people, got their hands on it. But basically he said the difference between the right and the left is not what they do, it's how they do it. They do things very, very differently. And the difference is between these kinds of things I've already been talking about, something that's very precise and something that's rather vague, something that's kind of explicit and requires, perfect attention, something that's vaguer, more general and fuzzy, and has a more kind of generic global kind of character to it. So the master key, the industrious ant, and the person who goes to the midpoint, the spirit of finesse and the spirit of geometry, we can say that they're rooted in actual brain physiology and brain function. And I know when I read Master and Emissary, I don't know, some years ago now, it really slotted things in for me because I could see how a lot of other things fit into this kind of dichotomy. But again, it's interesting, next slide, that McGilchrist certainly wasn't the first one to recognize this, but he was the first one to put it on or one of the people to put it on some really strong neuro psychological basis. But in the early 20th century, a classicist, fellow named Francis Cornford, was there. He wrote a remarkable book called From Religion to Philosophy. And it goes back to this whole idea of the shift from the mythic to the mental. And that's most histories of ideas, most histories of philosophy will say, yes, there was a sudden break. And suddenly Thales woke up one day and he just, he had it with all the myths and he was going to go find out exactly what was happening and he wasn't going to take all these stories anymore. Well, it's not quite like that. It lingered for a while. And in fact, throughout the early period of Greek philosophy, the mythic and the mental kind of worked together. And this is because, as Cornford came to recognize, there are two permanent needs in the human nature. And there's a need for the precise, but also a need for the vague. And again, it may seem counterintuitive that we need for a vague, don't we want things, very simple and direct and crystal clear? Yes, but not everything. If the sun's out, we can't see the stars. The vague is, what is meaningful for us is the vague. It's the imprecise. It's what we can't say explicitly. A piece of music moves you terribly, but you can't really say exactly why. And you can't say exactly what Beethoven is doing in that piece of music. When you do, and you say, yes, at this point, this is when the peasants have left the, and they're out in the fields, like it's not a movie. It's not like that. It evokes feelings, that evokes images and things of that sort. But you can't pin it down explicitly. This is this kind of sense of a kind of implicit, hovering, global kind of meaning. And whereas the rise of science and the rise of that new way of knowing wanted to get rid of that, Cornford is saying, no, that's part of ourselves. And he talks about this other tradition. The next one. And that's the Pythagorean tradition. And I said earlier, I was calling Thales a philosopher, but it was a bit anachronistic because the word hadn't been invented yet. The word philosopher was founded or coined by Pythagoras, lover of wisdom. And Pythagoras came a little bit after Thales and the other sort of Ionian philosophers, who were the ones who were interested in trying to understand what stuff was made of. But he wasn't like that. He had one foot in the older mythical tradition, and he also was very aware of the new, rational, whatever you want to call it, this new way of knowing, this mental way. We talk about Pythagorean theorem and things of that sort. But Pythagoras, his own kind of tradition in school, emerged out of a refinement of the earlier Dionysian and the Orphic traditions. And the Dionysian was this kind of mad, chaotic, wild, bacchanal plunge into the unconscious, and the Orphic was a way of sort of through an ascetic path where you detach your soul, your inner world from the body and all that. But Pythagoras sort of refined even that to, no, we can arrive at this sense of the holy and the religious through understanding the laws of the universe, through understanding, and we can have them in ourselves as well. And the whole idea of harmony and balance and all of that. And this notion of harmony and balance itself is something that's going to be very important to this tradition, because it is about, the way I see it, and the reason I have people like Pascal and Junger and others, is that it's two sides. It's not just, okay, I'm just a scientist and I'm not going to have anything to do with the mythic, or I'm just a sort of, mythopoeographer and I'm not going to have anything to do with science and rationality. No, it's just where they come together, and a balance is precisely that. It's harmony is precisely that. It's when you have the two opposing things that are in a kind of creative tension. And Pythagoras had both feet in both camps, and even Plato did too. I mean, Plato's a perfect example, because whenever Plato wants to undermine someone in a debate, and he wants to show that they don't know what they're talking about, Socrates will engage in this very irritating dialectic. And he was known as the gadfly, and because it was a pain to talk to him. People ran away from him because he would say, "Oh, you there, Euthyphro. People tell me you know all about piety." "Oh, yes, Socrates. Well, tell me." And then he'll talk to you, and eventually you'll become, you realize you don't know what you thought you knew, you didn't know. And so Socrates is able to undermine that. But whenever Plato wants to make a positive message, he tells a story. There's the myth of the cave, or the myth of So he has his feet in both camps. It's a likely story. This is a likely story, he would say, and it somehow shows something. It's not arguing and the kind of thing. But that, as I said, that starts to sort of die out, and you get Aristotle as, becomes kind of again, it's a bit of a cliche, but he's sort of recognized as the first kind of scientist. But this is this other tradition that's there. And what I do in the other book, Secret Teachers, and what I kind of do here in Lost Knowledge, is kind of show different ways of that. But Pythagorean tradition doesn't mean you have to follow the teachings of Pythagoras. It just means that it's this attempt to try and have the two kind of ways of knowing work together. And there's a good reason for that. Next one. Because it's a difference between having two kinds of cultures that are at odds with each other, which was the thesis of an important book in the 1950s called The Two Cultures in the Scientific Revolution by C.P. Snow, who was a scientist and a novelist. He basically argued that all the humanists and all the writers and literary critics, they basically got to get up to speed with science, because the science is the way things are going. You're just going to get left behind. Or is it this coming together? And that's why I call it the Goldilocks effect, or sort of the Goldilocks moment, when things are just right. where it's not, there must be some deep esoteric sort of business going on with the Goldilocks sort of fairy tale, because this is three business, and it's like, it's too cold, it's too hot, but that's just right. That's too soft, that's too hard, but that's just right. It's the kind of middle way. It's the kind of the whole Goldilocks, to me, it just seems, story is about precisely what I'm talking about, is bringing these polarities together into the just right, when the two things work together. And it works out fine for her. Everything is the best for her when it's the third one in just right. And so my own experience, and the experience of people I write about in the book, and who make good arguments about this, is that when these two different ways of knowing are brought together, not when one dominates over the other or one eclipses the other, that's when you have the true, deep kind of creative moments. And that's where, the kind of depth of reality is revealed. Next one. Okay, I was just going to say, and that's precisely what the esoteric tradition is about in different kinds of ways. We have the Kabbalistic tree of life, and on the other side we have the yin yang. And both of them are more or less saying the same thing. You have these polarities that are in a tension, and they need to be brought together. The tree of life, you have the middle way, and the severity and mercy, you have the two extremes. Bring them together, you get that just right kind of moment. And likewise, so this is something I would say that's common, through humanity across the planet, and it's something that it just struck me as so obvious after I was sort of reading about McGilchrist and the two sides of the brain working together. And I thought, well, isn't this intuitively what the esoteric traditions are about? And you can see it in a variety of different ways: the pineal gland, the chakras, so many different sort of images and themes and sort of motifs suggest this kind of union of these different sort of ways of knowing. Okay, I think I've got a couple more. Next one. Okay, so here I was going to say Kathleen Raine, just to sum it up, that, as I said earlier, the phrase lost knowledge of the imagination comes from Kathleen Raine. Kathleen Raine was a remarkable poet, a Blake scholar, and essayist. And I had the good fortune of meeting her a few times, and I interviewed her once many years ago. She died in 2003, I think at the age of 95, if I'm not mistaken. But for many years, she guided what was known as the Temenos Academy. It's still going on, which is sort of alternative educational establishment dedicated to what she called the lost knowledge of the imagination, or the tradition of the imagination. And this was something that she found in people like William Blake and Coleridge and other poets of the sort of romantic, English romantic period, but also in people like Yeats and Jung and others, and Henri Corbin and that tradition, which we'll get onto later on. And what it was is basically, it was a tradition that took the imagination seriously. It took the imagination not as it came to be understood post the scientific revolution, or post the rise of the new way of knowing, where it became just your imagination, or that's only imagination, or imagination was something that was a form of fantasy, or even in the early days of the attack on the Hermetic tradition. I mean, one of the things McGilchrist talks about is that the two sides of the brain have a kind of rivalry going, and they're sort of friendly friendly enemies. But in recent times, the left has kind of taken over and is dominating, and is kind of putting the right out of business. And one of the things I say in my book, Secret Teachers, that it strikes me that with the rise of that scientific tradition, you also had the undermining of the Hermetic tradition. And I see the Hermetic esoteric Gnostic tradition as a kind of body of right brain kind of knowledge, or a body of imaginative knowledge. And in order to establish itself as the dominant way of knowing, it had to undermine that completely. So you have a remarkable kind of character assassination of people like Hermes Trismegistos and the Rosicrucians and the whole other crew of people. Robert Flood was one of the great sort of post-Rosicrucian Hermetic thinkers who tried to battle against it. And there's a book by Marin Marcin that completely sort of, takes Flood to task remarkably. So there was a whole kind of, it wasn't just, oh yes, we've just discovered that this way works and that way doesn't. It's like, no, this is the truth, and we have to just completely annihilate this other way. We have to get rid of the competition. So she rediscovered this tradition of the imagination that goes back to the Hermetics. It goes back to the Neoplatonics. I said, Pythagoras and Plato. It emerges later on during the Alexandrian period, say around 200 or so, up until the close of the Platonic Academy, in Neoplatonism. And what Kathleen Raine said was basically what these romantic poets are talking about. They're talking about the experience of the soul, the experience of the inner world that the Neoplatonics were talking about. And so she's responsible for sort of saying there is this whole kind of tradition there, and she dedicated herself to teaching it. And again, she was someone who, another one of these who tried to combine the two, because even though she loved poetry from an early age and she was writing it from an early age, when she went to Cambridge in the 1920s, she studied science. She studied botany and biology. She said, the idea of studying literature and poetry in university strikes me as ridiculous. I'm already reading all these things. I want to understand nature in this other way. I'm already understanding it through the vision of the poets. Now I want to understand it through the vision of the biologists and all that. So again, it's another example of bringing the two kind of ways together. But two more slides. Let's see, just quickly. Thing is, if you go to any dictionary and you look up imagination, the definitions will generally say it's about something unreal in one way or another. In the book, I have some quotes from Cambridge and Oxford and Merriam-Webster and others. But fundamentally, the idea is the imagination concerns itself with the unreal. And I want to say that's absolutely untrue. It's the exact opposite that's true. The next slide, and I'll show you why. The one definition of the imagination that I do kind of, own up to or say, yes, I agree with in the book is one that comes from, again, Colin Wilson, who I mentioned earlier. And he said, the imagination is the ability to grasp realities that are not immediately present. And I think, if you think about that, I think you understand that, yes, imagination isn't about make-believe. It's actually about making real. When you realize something, I mean, one of the examples Wilson gives is the famous opening of Proust's novel, Remembrance of Things Past. And if you know the novel, Proust, his alter ego, it's not really him, but it is him in the book, even though he doesn't use his name. He has a little cake, it's called a Madeleine, and he dips it in some tea and he tastes it. And it reminds him of something, and he can't quite, grab what it is, and it really bothers him that he can't do this. So he tries and tries and tries. And this is actually the beginning of the book. This is the reason why he goes and writes this huge novel about his past. It's an enormous, sort of 3-volume novel. But he tries to understand, what is this that I can't remember? And then suddenly it comes back to him. And it was when he was a little boy and he went on holiday to the north of France. His aunt used to give him a little taste of this Madeleine dipped in a tisane, a kind of herbal tea. And it isn't just the information, the fact that he was there, which he someone asked him, so yes, I used to do that. It all came back in a, total global 3D, HD, whatever you want to call it, total recall moment. And it lifted him up above his experience at the time. And the reason he wrote this enormous novel is about time recaptured. That moment, that memory coming back to him, lifted him above man and time, the way Nietzsche talks about when he had the inspiration for Thus Spake Zarathustra. He's 6,000 feet above man and time. Suddenly, Proust, and like so many others they realize that this idea that I'm trapped in the immediate moment, I'm trapped in the immediate reality around me, it's unreal. It's not true. My whole past is just as real as this moment now. And it's not just nostalgia. It's not a nostalgia. He's grabbing the actual concrete, visceral reality of the times that existed. And for that moment, he can feel them as reality. And he even says in the book, my worries became innocuous, my mortality, didn't matter. And if you know Proust, he's a hypochondriac. He's always ill. He's always worried about everything. And then suddenly he's lifted above all these everyday worries and he feels, outside of time and space. So this is an example Wilson gives, and there's many, many, many others in his books. And he calls it Faculty X, and that's just because he doesn't have a name for it. But it's this strange ability we have to grasp realities that are not immediately present. And this is, imagination has this power to inform our experience in order to make it real. Okay, so that's, let's say, I think one more is just what we're going to get on to next time. Okay, next time we're going to sort of take this and look at it in a different way. So this one was about understanding, okay, what's the difference between these two different ways of knowing? how did we lose the other one, and what is it like? And I would say we already experience these things all the time, but we don't pay attention to them. We don't, or most of us don't, and we don't quite, put them together in the same place and then say, that's funny, all those things added up and they make me realize, I can understand the world in this way. We don't quite do that, but if we pay attention to our experience, I think we'll see that many of the things I was talking about is something that happened to us all the time. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Gary. That was
my
fantastic. Pleasure. So we do have some questions that are coming in, some good ones. And I just want to quickly note, anybody who is here and present and would like to hop on the microphone, you are more than welcome to do that. Just let me know in the chat box ahead of time, and then you can unmute yourself, or I can help you get unmuted. Just a quick note there. Okay, so the first question is from Mike. And Mike was asking, do you think that these changes in our understanding of the universe were accompanied by physical changes in the brain?
No. I think it takes quite a long time for sort of physical things to take place. I mean, I'm not a neuroscience scientist, but I think it's more about maybe changes in how we use the brain we have already.
Right, yeah.
Short answer.
Okay, so the next question, this is from Heather, and Heather's saying, the just right that you talked about isn't like a synthesis in a dialectical sense, though, right? Is it more like a post-dialectical moment of paradox, a tension of opposites, a resonating lyre in a Gebser sense? I'm curious to hear more about a distinction around that.
Well, I try to stay away, tell you the truth, from sort of abstractions in that kind of way when I talk about it. So I kind of think of it in terms of sort of experience. What is it like when that happens? So I try to think of these things or explain them or talk about them more in metaphor or analogy or something like that. But one of the things that I do find ties in with this, and I gave a talk about this in London earlier this year, was something that Jung calls the transcendent function. I don't know if you know. Jung wrote a commentary on a book called The Secret of the Golden Flower. That was a translation of a Chinese Taoist alchemical text by Richard Wilhelm. And Wilhelm, I'm sure you know, is the translation of the I Ching that's been enormously popular for years. And as Jung usually does when he writes commentaries, he basically says, well, the Chinese alchemists thought they were doing this, but actually they were doing what I'm doing, my kind of thing. So you have to take that on board. But he understood this kind of practice, this meditative practice that the Taoist alchemists were doing in order to create the diamond body, which was this kind of astral body or some kind of spiritual body that will survive physical death. Jung wasn't interested in that so much. What he was interested in was this kind of experience that happened that he talked about in terms of when the unconscious and the conscious come together. And if you know his practice of active imagination, that grew out of his understanding of what this, it went back earlier to his own kind of confrontation with the unconscious. Well, I talk about it later in the book, I talk about it later in the course. But fundamentally, a transcendent function is this kind of lift that the psyche experiences. It's a sort of inner lift that we feel when sort of the conscious mind and the unconscious somehow come together. And one of the ways in which you can sort of trigger that, Jung said, was to do what he called active imagination, which is basically you sort of let yourself slip into a kind of state of reverie. You're not quite asleep, but you're not fully awake, and you can allow dreams and sort of fantasies and things to kind of rise up. And if you kind of do this often enough, you can learn how to sort of maneuver and navigate in that space, and interesting things will happen. I mean, they do. I mean, I've had some experience of this, and they do take place. And what Jung felt was that when his clients practiced this, they found that some insoluble problem that they had been trapped in for a very long time, suddenly it didn't disappear, but they themselves were somehow raised up above the problem. And it wasn't a problem anymore. Something that they felt they just could not get past in some way, in a relationship, whatever it was. Now they saw a way past it. And it was as if more mature, or I can't get away from, the sort of spatial metaphors, but a higher part of themselves had been kind of activated where before they were sort of down. And so to me, this Goldilocks just right, it's something, if you can feel it, I feel it when I'm writing. That's the time when I'm most in a kind of dialogue with whatever it is you want to call it, the unconscious, the subconscious, George. I don't, you call it whatever you want to, but it's the other part of me that's there. And again, the reason why it's important to pass over these activities to some part of ourselves we don't have to think about, so that the other part can be, okay, now I'm going to think about what I'm going to write. So I think about what I'm going to write. The other part kind of throws up the intuitions to me. I kind of translate that into the words. And then there is this kind of, rapport going on. So it's something like that. I know I feel more solid and real when I'm doing that. Whereas other times, and I'm sort of less immediately in rapport with this other part of myself, I could be fretting about things and all like that. So I think you can get lost in a lot of definitions, and especially with Gebser, because Gebser's everything's a something, so it's not that. So it's like Gebser's very difficult to do, and I think in this kind of context. But I don't know. I would have to look at it, and I don't know what Gebser would think about all this stuff about the left and right brain. I do try to bring him together with McGilchrist in my book Secret Teachers. I do kind of show where they seem to be fellow traveling in some way, and I've been in. I know Ian McGilchrist, and I've corresponded with him, and he says, people have suggested that he read Gebser, so I don't know if he has yet or not, but I don't know if that's answered your question, but that's sort of the best way I can approach it.
Great. I didn't know that about McGilchrist and Gebser. I'm curious to see what his insight would be on a read through there. But yeah, Heather, just let us know if that was a interesting answer and provided some insight for you. And so let's see if we have another. Yes, we have a live person wanting to come on.
Okay.
Find you, Marcus. Let's see. Here you are. I'm going to unmute you, Marcus.
Oh.
Hi, Marcus. Can you hear us? Oh, you're muted again. 1 second. Let's see. Sorry, folks.
Can you hear me?
There you are. Hi.
Okay. Thank you for that, Gary. That was great.
My pleasure.
I have a question, kind of follow up to what was just asked a little bit in terms of like that type of right brain knowledge. Like what kind of, is there any metaphysical baggage that comes along with that? I mean, I think in Lost Knowledge, you kind of talk about, Thomas Taylor and some of these thinkers, they have a sort of Neoplatonic to it. So I'm just wondering if you take that part, the metaphysical idealism, kind of seriously, or.
Well, I mean, it depends. When I'm reading it, I do. I take it very seriously. But I wouldn't necessarily say I was a Neoplatonist per se, because I have a lot of existential kind of feeling about these things at the same time. But I'm just trying. Again, it's like, for Kathleen Rain, there's that particular strain is what she kind of talks about and what she wants to. So it's a Neoplatonic that, and she also, that relates to lots of things. It relates to Hermeticism. It relates to Corbin with Suhaswardi and all of that kind of thing. That doesn't necessarily, how should we say it, the kind of global, fuzzy, vague, implicit understanding of something isn't necessarily the same as that. But I would say they're in the same kind of general, they're under the same kind of umbrella. I think they, put it this way, I don't think you could have the kind of more articulated metaphysics that Kathleen Rain's referring to in the Neoplatonic tradition without that kind of earlier right brain kind of global kind of thing. Because it's out from that the more particular, explicit, precise kind of thinking comes. It sort of rises up out of this inarticulate, vague sense of myth and all that. As you know, I mean, Plotinus is very hardcore metaphysics and very cerebral, but the Neoplatonists that came after him are less so. And by the time you get to Iamblichus and Proclus, they're very much like the Gnostics. They have, levels of different beings, and Iamblichus is doing rituals in order to somehow reach these higher levels of consciousness, which Plotinus, he wouldn't have agreed with that. He wasn't, interested in the mythic approach at all. He was much more, sort of strictly mental. So, I mean, there's gradations, and, so I think these things fall into the same ballpark, but they don't necessarily, they're not necessarily the same kind of thing. Although, when you read about, like William Blake says, we become what we behold. William Blake says, we think the world is without, but it's within. And John Keats says something similar, and he talks about one of his letters. He talks about looking down at a bird, pecking at the gravel, and he finds himself feeling that he's that bird doing that. So that there's part of the poetic tradition, and that's very much along the lines of kind of the kind of right brain, and participatory, empathic kind of knowing that McGilchrist is talking about, and also esoteric teachers like Schwala de Lubitsch. I'll probably get onto him at one of the other ones. He talks about the intelligence of the heart. And Pascal's talking about, the reasons of the heart. So they're talking about the same kind of thing. What I tend to like to do is read as much as I can and kind of like, connect the dots between these things. So you can see there's a whole tradition about that. So I hope that's answered your question.
Yeah, definitely. And
Okay.
If I can ask a quick follow-up, if you don't mind.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it seems like you sort of see the Neoplatonic stuff is almost like an effect of right brain thinking, in a way, rather than the cause, perhaps, which is interesting. Because like my only concern with it is that it can become its own kind of constricted.
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, any of these things can. No,
Yeah.
that's true. Yeah, I mean, any of them can. Myths can become dogmas, and I mean, God, one of the things I find because I write books about lots of different people, Jung or Steiner or Swedenborg or Crowley, is you get the Jungians or the Crowleyans that are more royal than the king. They become very solid and dogmatic, and so yeah, that can happen. That's why you need new kind of bursts of this kind of imagination. It's not the tradition itself, it's the actual, this is one of the things where Kathleen Rain argues against people like Guénon, because Guénon has this idea of tradition, and tradition is like, it's there. It's something that's there, and you have to stick to it. And if you don't stick to it, you're decadent, and you're going down with the Kali Yuga. But for Kathleen Rain, tradition isn't about some text or some teaching. Traditions the source of it comes from here. It comes from the imagination, and the imagination it's creative by definition. It has to be new and different. It can't, if you keep just churning out the same kind of thing. So, no, all these things need reviving and all that. And certainly, I would myself, because when I'm reading sort of the later Neoplatonists, it does get to be a bit like, just like the Gnostics. To me, it's like levels and levels and levels of these different kinds of things, and it gets a bit complex for me. And so you can get lost in that as well. No, I definitely agree. That's why I try to bring in people that don't really have a connection to this as well. I mean, I talk about people that are not part of this tradition, but they're somehow pursuing a similar kind of phenomena.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Marcus. Okay, so I don't think anybody wants to pop on the mic yet, but just want to continue to encourage everyone. But we do have a question, two questions that kind of relate here. One is from Mike and one is from Francis. And so I'll just ask Mike's first. Are the two ways of knowing coming back together, or are they getting further apart? And does our survival depend on the answer? And then Francis is asking something similar. Are we at a just right moment where our consciousness can evolve in our lifetime? Okay,
well, in the middle of all those, yes, a lot depends on it. It absolutely depends on it. I agree. Are we in one of those now? I think we're sort of in a, how should we say, we're in a time when it's possible. It's needed. And this is one of the things McGilchrist says, and also Jung says as well. Neurotic symptoms are a sign that the psyche is trying to deal with things. It's trying to, it's self-regulating. So it's not dealing with it very well, but at least it's trying to deal with things. So the neuroses that, we're experiencing on a planetary way that give us, keep us up at night. In a way, they're good signs because the distress is becoming more and more evident. And so something will have to happen. Whether it happens or not, I think depends on, us. There isn't some collective mind out there other than the participants in it. It's all of us now. I'd like to think that the people on this course now, and people read my books, we're trying to understand how this can happen, or how it happens already and recognize it as something that's part of our experience already, so that it's not something we have to prove. You know, like you have to prove the UFOs landed, or you have to prove that spirits exist. Well, we already understand the world in this kind of way, in different ways and to different degrees. And so we don't have to prove it. I think we have to document it more than anything else, and maybe convince ourselves about it. But no, there's there's a line from the German poet Friedrich Hölderlin, and I have a free translation where it basically says, you know, where there is danger, deliverance lies also. And so kind of, you know, when things seem the most dangerous or, you know, precipitous, that's precisely the time when the thing that's most needed won't necessarily happen, but can appear. But it's up to us to do it.
Great answer. So this one is from Susan, and Susan's asking, are you saying that when we go back to a visceral experience in memory, we are actually there, as in time non-existent, or outside of time, or circling back? Just looking for...
Well, it depends how far you want to go with it. Some people say yes. Again, Colin Wilson, whose work has had enormous influence my own, the book that sort of got me going, doing interest in all this kind of stuff, is a book of his called The Occult that was published in the early 70s. I read it in 1975. But one of the things he talks about is precisely this whole, what he calls bilocation. And he gives the example of Proust, you know, tasting the cake and being sent back to his childhood. But there's other examples where people actually have appeared. And he gives examples of the poet Goethe, where he tells a story of somehow, you know, he's on a journey to go see someone and they saw him coming before he arrived and all that kind of thing. And an incredible one is told by the Swedish playwright August Strindberg. And Strindberg, again, is another interesting character because he was deeply interested in Hermeticism and the esoteric, and he practiced alchemy in Paris in the 1890s. And he was a deep reader of Swedenborg as well. But he tells a story when he was in a pub or a cafe somewhere in Stockholm or someplace, and he was trying to convince somebody not to do something. And while he was doing that, he was reminded of a similar occasion when he did something much the same. And it was in a different town, in a different cafe or something like that. And he somehow became so aware of that other occasion that he sort of shifted into it. And he even said to the person, no, please be quiet. I'm not here right now. And there's another occasion when his mother-in-law says that he appeared. So, you know, whether you believe in this or not, I personally myself have not experienced it, but I know I have experienced the kind of Proustian effect where something that I knew, something in my past, but I hadn't thought about for ages, you know, suddenly comes back. And there is this sense, there is a momentary sense of being outside time. And the reason I read all this stuff and write all these books is I believe fundamentally we are. I think fundamentally time and space and all these things are somehow, they're factors of consciousness in some way, you know, and I guess the idea somehow is to understand consciousness enough to be able to not feel, you know, the constraints of those. And again, it's something that happens already, something that happens in our experience. If you read Wilson, he catalogs so many experiences of this and in literature and in experience. One of the another famous one is the historian Arnold Toynbee, who I write about in a couple of my books. He was in Greece and he was on the site of a city called Mistra. And actually Mistra is an interesting coincidence because it was the home of a fellow named Gemistus Plethon, who was the Byzantine scholar who brought the whole idea of the perennial philosophy to the West during the Council of Ferrara in Florence in the late 1440s. But incidentally, the town had been destroyed by the Mongols at some point, and it was left for a ruin. And Toynbee was there, and he was sort of very relaxed and sitting there and enjoying himself. And he said he slipped into what he called a time pocket, and he felt that actually he was there on the site during the last sort of, you know, siege when the town was destroyed by the invaders, and he could actually see the army around and all that. So, I mean, there's famous examples of that, and I keep an open mind on it, you know, and I don't see why it can't happen. Put it that way. So yes, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, you actually brought to mind something too for me that I've been reading Deleuze recently, and as you know, Deleuze is very influenced and very interested in Bergson.
Yes,
He wrote about
absolutely,
Bergsonism and memory and so on. So Deleuze has these lines. I'm just going to paraphrase with him that we to remember something is to create it. Like the past is this almost like an organic living thing that is made every time we think about it, and so we actually encounter it. So just another scholar.
Yeah. And Proust was a reader of Bergson. I mean, that's one of the things that's famous about the novel. He takes Bergson's ideas of unconscious memory, things that we haven't picked up explicitly, but our consciousness, whatever you want to call it, is picked up, and then they come back. So yeah, I mean, all that's there. Well, again, it's the famous story of who was it, Wilder Penfield. Penfield, whatever when he was operating on one of his patient's brain, and the brain doesn't feel any pain, so it wasn't anesthetized, and he sort of touched something, and suddenly the patient was back in some previous time in the past, and it was absolute 3D. So again, there's the old stories about people seeing their lives pass before their eyes as they're drowning and that kind of thing. So I mean, again, these things all point to something that's there, I would say, and I think it just takes a lot of attention and kind of just attention and just awareness of it to notice that these things happen all the time.
Yeah, and as you mentioned too before, Gebser talked a little bit about, quite a lot about this very occlusively, but throughout Ever Present Origin, he's mentioning that the past is present and it's something that's as real as the future, and so there's this kind of co-presence. So what does that mean? I think we're kind of circumnavigating around.
We're working on it. We're working on what that means. That's what we're doing.
So we have a few more questions, if that's all right. We're at
sure.
2 minutes, but we can. Okay. So Sergio has this good one, and this is sort of an evolution of consciousness question. If I understand it, there was a time when this lost knowledge was used. And so why do you think it was necessary to shift for humans when it was already just right? So why did we move away from when it was in that golden...
Well, it wasn't just right. That's the thing. It wasn't just right. For some reason, best known to the forces of evolution or Mother Nature, we are the beings that have been picked to develop self-consciousness, to be aware that we are aware, to be aware of the world around us. And we'll get into this more in the next session, because I talk about the work of a fellow named Owen Barfield, who's a very important writer on the evolution of consciousness. He writes about it through sort of studies of language. But he and people like Gebser and people like Steiner and Swedenborg and Jung and others, they all posit an earlier time when we were embedded in the world. We were participating with it in the same way that trees and plants and if Bergson's or David Chandler's right, rocks and stones are as well. But we lack self-consciousness, and somehow it's on the agenda of evolution for self-consciousness to emerge. And you have to sort of think, well, is it better that you and we all can have this conversation now and think about these things and detach from everything around us and be able to observe it in some way objectively as much as we can, and with all the collateral damage, let's say, or collateral aggravation that comes with that, the sense of existential angst and a variety of other problems, all the problems facing the planet? Or would it have been better had we just stayed, completely embedded with nature like everything else? This goes back to the ancient question, is it better to be Socrates or a pig? A pig is happy all the time and doesn't really think about anything, but, after all, it's a pig. So, I mean, maybe that's awfully human or speciesist of me, but I can't but, from my perspective, think that, well, yes, at times it's probably lovely to just wallow around and roll around, and we all do that. And, I may very well try to do that later this evening, relaxing after this long session. But, the whole business of trying to understand, which we're doing, that's why, somehow we have to go through this period where we detach from, the warm embrace of the one to be able to see it explicitly. And that's something, metaphysically, you could just think of it that way, but you could also think of it in the way that McGilchrist spells it out in his book, where he says that right brain thinking is earlier. That's why the book is called The Master and His Emissary. The right brain is the master. The left brain was basically invented by the right brain in order to help it understand the world better. So where the right brain presents this general, global, vague picture of implicit meaning that's, kind of fuzzy and vague, but you feel it. The left brain focuses in on specific, bits and pieces of it and unpacks that, and, but it does that by detaching. And it's that detaching that's made us so successful, but it's also that detaching that has led to this sense of being lost in the cosmos. And, as you say, the kind of lack of feeling connection to the world has led to our taking advantage of it and all the ecological problems and all that. But I would say this is, what do you want to say, an unavoidable damage on the way to a fuller consciousness. And I would think that, yes, the next step, and again, different people have said this in a variety of ways, it's not a return back to the earlier form. I think that's one of the problems with, what do you want to call it, a lot of kind of back to nature or the archaic revival or something like that. It's about, this was just a big mistake. Becoming self-conscious and having egos and rash, this was just one big mistake. We just got to go back. And it just doesn't work. I mean, no matter how hard you try, no matter how many drugs you take or how often you stay in the forest, you just are not going to go back and be a plant. You're not going to go back and be an animal. You're stuck with this human consciousness. And a lot of people have tried to get rid of it. I mean, you all know, brilliant people blow their brains out because they're just tired of carrying around this painful consciousness. But this is the barrier we have to get through. We have to, Colin Wilson talks about this whole idea of kind of breaking the existential sound barrier. In the early days of jet travel, the jets were trying to break the sound barrier, but they couldn't get up enough speed to do it, and somehow they hit a kind of wall, and they would crash. But similarly, with our own interior, travels, there's a kind of existential barrier that we have to kind of get through, and I think that's sort of what we're going through now. I mean, Gebser talks about the kind of 3 days down in hell, you can say, it's the dark night of the soul, or, a variety of different ways of understanding this. I mean, there's no guarantees that this is the case. This is the story I tell myself. I tell myself we're facing all these challenges now in order to somehow trigger, what we have inside us in order to meet the challenges. And Toynbee said that's the motor of history, challenge and response. If the challenge is too great, then we're smashed. If the challenge isn't great enough, we're complacent, we take it too easy, and we just kind of decay. But if the challenge is just right, and again, it's the Goldilocks theory of history, the challenge being just right, we meet it with the energy, not only to overcome it, but to keep on growing. And that's my hope. I believe there's enough people out there in the world. I don't know who they are. I call them the creative minority. And they, I don't want to get together with them for anything. I just know they're out there in the world, and they're doing the same thing I'm doing. And at some point, all of our efforts, it's the whole idea of non-locality. There's non-locality in the brain, non-locality with particles, non-locality with people around the planet. I don't know exactly what that other person is doing, but our combined efforts will come together at some point and help push us over the next hurdle.
Fantastic answer. Thank you, Gary.
My pleasure.
Yeah, I took some notes there. But okay, so we're at 12:34 here. So maybe we can squeeze in one or two more questions and then wrap it up. So this is more of a kind of a class question.
Okay.
Chris, I've read Secret History, Secret Teachers, and Lost Knowledge. Could Gary comment on what to expect from Rain and Corban, and if one should be read before the other in terms of when they'll be addressed in the next sessions?
I think probably get on to Corbin in the last one, because he talks about the responsibility of the imagination, or the need for something like that. And he's someone that's in that Neoplatonic tradition that Marcus was talking about earlier, and that Rain talks about. And so that probably later on, the last one. I mean, the next one coming up, you're going to talk about Owen Barfield and Goethe. Goethe's sort of exploration of what he calls the Urpflanze, which is this primal plant. And it's a kind of imaginal plant. It's neither an abstract idea, nor is it a physical plant, but it's somewhere in between. And I say the Germans are onto this. The Germans are onto this kind of stuff. Obviously, you got Gebser, German speaking. I mean, one of the earliest sort of texts about this kind of thing is by a friend of Goethe, it was Friedrich Schiller, and his letters on aesthetic education. And Schiller wrote a series of letters, and they're basically about he didn't talk about the two different ways of knowing, but he was talking about the kind of, this rational knowledge and the emotional side, the inner, the aesthetic inner side of man. It was a way had to bring the two together. And again, it's this kind of when the two things meet, something. Again, it is kind of like a traditional, Hegelian three-step. The two things meet, and something more than either of them is produced. But that's a way of understanding it. It's not. I don't want to get, okay, that's your system. It's not a system. It's trying to find ways to try to describe and point to and allude to an experience. It's a sort of that's why I try to keep it on an existential level, sort of like, well, what is it like when this sort of thing happens?
Great. So our last question to squeeze in here, just to respect your time, Gary. This is more about time, actually. It's from Adam, just asking about the relationship between consciousness and time, and if we're short on time, is this something we can address maybe next week?
Well, in the physical world, we're short on time because I have to go make something to eat. But in the broader world out there, we have all we need. And yes, the two are very connected. I would say consciousness time is a factor of consciousness. It's like I don't know who said, was it it's probably considered a sexist remark now, but it's like Einstein said something like, 5 minutes waiting for the dentist is different than 5 minutes with a beautiful woman sitting on your knee. They're both 5 minutes, but they're very, very different. One is too short and the other's too long, but they're both 5 minutes. So it's something that's a factor of consciousness. And again, you could say there's different kinds of time, or we understand the world in different ways. And one way of understanding it is this kind of sequential, linear kind of thing, which is tied into that other way of knowing, the quantitative one. But the other one, like the kind that Proust or Bergson talks about, it's more spatial. It's a duration. That was a Bergsonian time, which is different than the kind of sequential time. But yes, we're out of time.
We're out of time. Okay. Well, thank you for your time, Gary. This was a fantastic.
My pleasure. This is fun.
Session.
Absolutely.
Yeah. A lot of folks are just saying, thank you, expressing their gratitude, and
I hope they're enjoying it. I try to give value for money, as they say here. So.
Francis is quoting, "As trouble arises, so too does a solution." So they're just saying thank you.
Absolutely. All right. Well, see you next week, I guess. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, see you on Saturday. We'll send everybody.
Absolutely. All right. My pleasure. Thank you all. Thank you all for coming. And
thanks, everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. I look forward to it. All right. Cheers.
Okay. Take care. Bye.